The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved over 30 years ago. So why is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization still active, still expanding, and still waging wars? In this episode, we will answer the question, why does NATO still exist? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was set up initially to counter Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union took place in 1991. So why does NATO still exist today? What is NATO doing now that it has no more enemies? The fact that this is even a question at all points to the fact that NATO's existence is not legitimate. You can ask any person off the street what NATO does, and they will tell you that it's some sort of peacekeeping force designed to keep Europe safe from outside threats. The idea that NATO is somehow a peacekeeping force is laughable at best and treacherous at worst. NATO is a military alliance, a tool of war, a tool of imperialism, and nothing more. And it is not needed in this day and age. If anything, it should have been dissolved immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. NATO has never been about peace. It was created in the aftermath of World War II, which had just ravaged Europe and destroyed much of the continent. In 1949, the United States, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom came together and signed the North Atlantic Treaty, which would later become the foundation for the creation of NATO. The goal of the treaty was for these nations to unite and protect one another in the event that they were attacked. This was so that if any one of them was attacked, the rest would come to their defense. This is exactly how the United Nations is supposed to work, but it doesn't, because most countries don't want world domination. This treaty basically created a bulwark against Soviet influence in Europe, which at the time was seen as an existential threat to the United States. The first thing you need to know about NATO is who funds it. NATO is funded by all of its member nations. But according to a report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the United States accounts for about 70% of NATO's funding. Over the past few years, the U.S. has pushed its European allies to increase their spending on their militaries. Europeans spend roughly 1.96% of their GDP on their militaries, while the U.S. spends 3.23% of its GDP on its military. Despite spending almost double what the Europeans spend, the U.S. has demanded that Europeans increase their spending on their militaries so that they can reach the NATO target of 2% of GDP. This is an attempt by the U.S. to get the Europeans to pay more of the cost of maintaining NATO. Another important thing to note is the way NATO is organized. While NATO is a union of different countries, it is commanded centrally by the United States. Let's take, for example, NATO's nuclear forces. There are 3 nuclear nations in NATO: the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. However, only the United States can deploy nuclear weapons across Europe. The other 2 NATO members must request permission from the United States if they want to use nuclear weapons. For example, if France wanted to use its nuclear arsenal to strike, it would have to ask the United States for permission first. It can't just do it on its own. NATO operates like the military arm of the U.S. rather than a cooperative effort between equal partners. The U.S. is in control of the military decisions made within NATO. Now that we know how NATO is structured and funded, let's go through the history of NATO and all of its expansions. When NATO was created in 1949, it only consisted of the founding members. However, during the Cold War, as tensions rose between the West and the Soviet Union, NATO grew. Greece and Turkey joined in 1952, followed by Germany in 1955. Then in 1982, Spain joined. All of these countries were somewhat supposedly threatened by the Soviet Union, so it made sense for them to join. NATO was created as a direct response to the Soviet Union, a bulwark against the spread of communism. Therefore, it makes sense that countries that bordered the Soviet Union would want to join NATO to ensure their safety. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, however, things started to change. As we mentioned earlier, the purpose of NATO was to counter Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the great imaginary enemy that threatened Europe and the rest of the world with communism. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO had no purpose. The original Soviet sphere of influence collapsed, and the threat of communism no longer existed. This is when many people expected NATO to dissolve. However, this is not what happened. Instead, NATO changed its mission. In 1999, NATO bombed Yugoslavia. This was the first time NATO would engage in combat without being provoked. They bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days over the Kosovo conflict. NATO did not face any opposition from any major world power. It is important to note that the bombing of Yugoslavia happened without the approval of the United Nations Security Council, which goes to show that NATO doesn't even follow the rules it sets for itself. NATO was created on the premise that it would be a defensive alliance, but the bombing of Yugoslavia showed that NATO was becoming more aggressive. Following the Kosovo War, NATO would continue to expand. In 2004, 7 more nations joined, bringing the total number of NATO members to 26. These new NATO members were Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. 4 of these nations were former Soviet republics, which goes to show how far NATO's influence had reached. If you remember from earlier, the whole purpose of NATO was to counter a supposed Soviet imperialism. By allowing 4 former Soviet republics into NATO, the United States was essentially sticking it to the Soviets right in their own backyard. Then in 2009, Albania and Croatia joined, bringing the total number of NATO members to 28. Finally, in 2017, Montenegro joined NATO, bringing the total number of NATO members to 30. So the question we posed at the beginning of this video is, why does NATO still exist? NATO exists because the United States wants it to. As we mentioned before, NATO has evolved into the military arm of the United States. The U.S. uses NATO as a tool to further American imperialism. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has become less about containing the Soviet Union and more about America's other foreign policy goals. NATO's continued existence also served to remind the world that the United States was still a superpower. Furthermore, NATO's continued existence also served to rally the nations of Europe around the United States. By keeping NATO around, the U.S. was able to convince the nations of Europe that it was still a valuable ally. It was a way for the U.S. to maintain its influence over Europe. Without NATO, the European nations may have drifted away from the United States. They may have started to forge their own path in the world, independent of the United States. But as long as NATO exists, the European nations will remain tied to the United States. NATO has no purpose. It doesn't need to exist anymore. It is simply a tool of American imperialism and nothing more. And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.